Oh, I love to count. Okay. All right, so ASP.NET, WebForms. It's an interesting technology because it's about the only one out there that tries to accomplish what it does, and that is almost like a simulation of a standard Windows application through the internet. Now these days we have, what they call single page applications or SPAs, and using tools like AngularJS or Knockout and things like that essentially are doing the same, but they're relying tremendously on all these different client libraries to give you that functionality talking to the internet for the data only, right? This is different in that it's all on the server. It's flexible because the server is looking after all that functionality and will work with virtually any browser, even the dumbest, most stupid, old browser that doesn't even understand JavaScript on the planet, right? And it will still give you that simulation of a fully interactive, event-driven, that's a key point, event-driven application, right? So it simulates that, interactive. It's open source, by the way. It went open source a few years back now, so people say, oh, I don't like to use Microsoft stuff. Well, although they developed it, now it's totally open source and supported by the open source community. So it's free to use to make money. You can become a millionaire from your ASPX applications, and away you go, right? You don't have to pay Microsoft anything for it. It is based on the .NET framework, and how many people have used something like PHP or another scripting language, server-side scripting language before? Anyone? Okay, that's okay. It's kind of an evolution of that in that, with those languages you would embed scripts, right, inside a web page. The very first versions, it would be right inside the HTML of the page, just like you would put a script tag for JavaScript, right? You'd have a script tag for server-side script. So eventually your whole web page would look like a bunch of spaghetti code because there'd be tags for server-side code, tags for client-side code, as well as the HTML and all the CSS and everything all jumbled up together, right? Well, this is kind of a nice separation of the code and big improvement on that approach, a real evolution of it. Okay. Basically what we do is we have reusable controls that we can put on these web forms. They call it a web form, right? And these controls can be our standard HTML elements. We can use them and manipulate them from the server, but even better, there's a whole bunch of new, very sophisticated controls, right? They encapsulate some functionality, so you just stick it on there because it has a job, right? Its job is maybe to let you select something out of a list, right? Or, from a collection of radio buttons and so on and so forth. And the thing is, it will modify the actual code that comes down to the client depending on the capability of the browser. We do have, through Visual Studio, a WYSIWYG. You familiar with that term? What you see is what you get, right? I usually dislike most WYSIWYG designers because some of them, like Dreamweaver, they put all these styles and things of their own in there. They mess up all your code with they think you should do it this way. Well, this one doesn't, right? To a great degree, it's very clean as a visual design tool. And what we do is you can create it all through code instead. If you really don't want to use Visual Studio, you don't have to, right? You can do this all with Notepad or Notepad++ or whatever tool you want, because in the end, these pages are just text, right? Mind you, you could also put on 1,000 pounds of rocks in your back and run up and down mountains if you really want to challenge yourself. Why would you, right? So, Visual Studio certainly makes it very easy with IntelliSense and things like that. So that's why we're going to use it. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, or hinted at, it determines the capability of the client browser it's talking with, right? I'll take a moment here and just diverge for a second. Think about how the internet works, especially right at the very beginning. It's a stateless. Stateless means it doesn't remember things for you automatically. There's no state management. So, like the state being maybe information you've entered into a form already, options you've selected and things like that. That's the current state of an application. Well, the internet is stateless. In other words, you fill out maybe information on a form, you click a submit button, it all gets sent to the internet, right? That's the request, and the server will prepare a response and send it back. But as far as the server is concerned, once it's dealt with your request and sent the response, That's it. It's done. It doesn't even remember anything about what happened just there. That's the stateless nature that the internet is based on. Obviously, that's not very useful, right? So that's where, earlier on they realized, well, gosh, maybe if we put this thing called a cookie out there, right, we can maintain a session so it can remember that it was talking to you 5 minutes ago or 2 minutes ago. And of course, how much information will it remember about that previous chat that you had together? Well, probably not very much unless you go to work and program that it's going to remember certain values, right? Problem with that is now for every user talking to the server, it's got to remember all these things. Pretty soon, if you have a large number of users, what's going to happen? The server's going to be overloaded trying to remember all this stuff. I mean, it's like me trying to remember your names, right? It's not going to happen. So it's the same kind of an issue comes up. So, how do you work around this, right? And there's various approaches that have come out. ASP.NET WebForms uses some very clever approaches that work very effectively. So it gives you instead, this sort of ability to adapt to the capability of the browser and give you that same functionality in the end. It might not be as elegant, okay, if you're using Netscape 2.0, right, as your client browser, then you're not going to get quite as smooth interaction with the server, but it will still work, right? That's the beauty of this system. It can work with just about any kind of a client. Automatic adjustment for browser capabilities. It generates the kind of code the browser supports. So we stick a single control on the page that has a job. How it does that job in terms of what it sends down to the client will be different depending on the capability of the client. So if it can use the latest, most advanced JavaScript libraries, it'll be writing dynamic HTML or something like that, right? Or using jQuery. If it can't support that, it'll use an older version, right, of client-side scripting. And if it can't do that, it will do it all on the server. Also, we get a nice clean structure to the page logic. Remember I mentioned before that in the earlier days of server-side scripting languages, you had all this spaghetti code of everything mixed together, and you easily get confused. Well, that line of code's executed on the server, this one on the client, this one's CSS, and so on. Well, this gives you an improvement on that in that most of the server-side code we rip out of the HTML of the page, right, and put it in a separate file. That works very well with another aspect that I can talk about because now you're learning some object-oriented programming, right? You know what objects are, classes, and so on, and they get compiled into dynamic link libraries, DLLs. Well, that's how this whole system runs. In the end, your web form, the two separate pages at a minimum that make it up, that client, the HTML page, the ASPX page itself, and the code behind page, the whole thing gets put together as a single class that gets compiled into a DLL. And that's what's actually executed on the server. It doesn't read through the code, right, of the text, okay? It does it once just to compile it, and from then on it's faster because it uses this compiled version. So that works nicely with this separate page structure as well, because it all in the end becomes a single logical element on the server. Okay, separate code files for design and code. The other thing then is, of course, you can have your great designers, the people who are good at Photoshop and things like that, and making the page look really pretty, right? And then you can have your programmers working on the code behind page, giving it all the functionality that it needs. Okay. Now I did mention that we can still use our standard HTML elements. The twist is, what we can do is add run@ equals server as an attribute. You know what an attribute is? It's that sort of name-value pair you put right inside the tag, right, of the web page. Well, run@ equals server, by adding that to any of the HTML elements, gives us the ability to refer to it in code on the server and change its attributes. So we could change anything you want, something as simple as a background color, right, or things like that, or fonts being used, or whatever, right, or values being displayed, right. Any of the attributes of the element can be changed on the server by doing that. So it's great because you can manipulate all that in server-side processing before the response is put together and sent back to the client. There's no disadvantage really, but it's even more powerful if we use this new class of controls that do more than that they actually dynamically generate content to be sent to the client, right? Okay, so are you ready for my big PowerPoint animation? Drum roll. Woo! Did you miss it? I can do it again. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So the new ASP.NET server controls, right? Inside the source of the page, you'll see ASP:, right? For these ones. That's actually just a namespace. Remember, this all gets compiled into a class, so namespaces are important for class development, right? In C# or VB or whatever. By the way, you can do this in pretty much any of the languages that are supported by Visual Studio. There's over 30 languages now. You can plug in and use Python, whatever you want, right? Obviously, the two common ones are C# and Visual Basic, right? We're going to focus on using C# because that's the language you're using mostly in this program from here on out. We might, the odd time, look at a little bit of the other languages, but for the most part, we'll do C#. Okay. So ASP is a namespace, and you'll see that as well as, of course, it still has to have run at equals server in the attributes of the control. At runtime, okay, what happens is these automatically generate vanilla HTML content. So you won't, view source on the client page and see ASP:, right? No, that stays on the server. It's processed there and will generate appropriate HTML for the client. So it'll probably just be, if it was an ASP text box, it'll probably just be input type equals text, right? That familiar one that we've all learned right in our first HTML course. Okay. So these server controls automatically maintain client entered values in those round trips. State management, right? You type something in a text box with a normal HTML input type equals text, send it off to the server. If you just get the data coming back again, by the way, all these web forms work on a supposition that when you submit, you're submitting the page back to itself. Just like when you work in a Windows application, Microsoft Word, right? You click on something, well, you're communicating with that page, right? The same idea. All submits by default are submitted back to the same page. Then it gets the data, reprocesses it, and sends the response. So these will actually remember their values, whereas an HTML element won't, unless you do extra work coding it, right? That's something we used to teach when you start off in your basic PHP course, for example, right? You'd have to pull the data that was entered in a text box out of the request. It would often be in the query string or the form collection, stored in a variable. And if you're going to redisplay the page to the user because they forgot to fill something out, well, then you had to manually take that out of the variable, put it into the input type equals text, right, into the HTML of the page that's sent back. Otherwise, the user would get pretty frustrated having to fill it in over and over again. Automatic. That's all automatic with web forms, and we'll see how that works in just a couple minutes. The other thing is, it's not like we're asking the server to remember all these values for each user. Instead, it stores it right in the HTML, tucks it away in there in one of those input type equals hidden, right? It encrypts it and stores it in there, so increases the size maybe a little bit of the request response cycle going back and forth, but it doesn't burden the server having to remember all the user's values. So no script required, it's all looked after automatically. We don't have to lift a finger, it just does it for us. I don't know about you, but I am lazy. Things that do the work for me, I usually like those things, right? Get up in the morning, my coffee's made for me, woo, yeah? The web page remembers its values, hey, I didn't have to write any code this time. I like that kind of thing. Okay, but if we view the source code, you'll see that all you get on the client side is easy, standard HTML that will run in any browser on the planet, right? So that's the really nice aspect of it. There's all kinds of built-in controls come with the tool, right? We'll see hundreds of them in the toolbox. And of course, that's not all, right? It's like the Ginsu knives. Order this now and we'll also throw in. Okay, there's a whole collection of additional free ones created by the community. Open source communities are great for this kind of thing, right? There's an Ajax toolkit with all kinds of really fancy controls as well that are totally free. But if you're willing to spend money, there's an entire industry of companies, Component One, a whole bunch of others. That's the first one that popped into my head. That is their whole business. They make these advanced controls. They do the programming for them, right? And then they sell them. You can buy, usually not so much individual controls, usually buy a suite of controls and so on. It might be a few $1,000s, right? As a developer, saves you a lot of time reinventing the wheel yourself, right? And so there's a whole industry in these advanced controls as well. Things that like give you like a spreadsheet, and you just drag and drop it on, point it at some data, and it gives them all the Excel kind of functionality, things like that, graphing, charts, and so on. But of course, a lot of that, as I said, is free as well. One of the interesting groups of controls that are built in already are validation controls. You did some work with validating data entered into a web page before, right? With JavaScript. You have to write a series of ifs and then check, is that blank still? If it is, then, add a message to say, oh, you got to fill this in, dummy, right? Things like that. Nice, useful, friendly messages to the client, to explain what's wrong on the page. A lot of work writing all that code. No more, right? Stick a few controls on, set a few properties, and again, remember, not only does it write the code for you, it writes appropriate code for the client browser, right? If the client browser is so dumb it can't run any code, it looks after it all on the server for you. We'll see how that works in a few minutes. Just to quickly run through them, required field validator, pretty obvious. That just means something's required, right? Range, so we can check for this is not just something is entered, but we have a range of possible values. It could be arranged numerically, could be a range of dates, right? Could be arranged alphabetically, and so on and so forth. Compare validator. Well, we can compare two input controls. Think confirm password, right? You're entering the same password twice. That's an obvious use for something like that. But it doesn't have to just be two controls. It can compare against a fixed value, right? So maybe, a minimum of $1,000 is the bid, right? Something like that, okay? The other thing that both of these, in fact, all three of those can do, the range and the compare, I don't think the regular expression does. So it's just those two. They also have built-in data type checking. So, if I say a range between this and that date, it automatically will also verify that it's a valid date. Okay, if you've ever had to write some JavaScript to confirm that, it's not January the 43rd, right, that's not a valid date, or that you've handled all the leap years and things like that, it's quite a pain writing all that manually. No more, right? This will actually confirm that it's a valid date, no matter whether it's a leap year or not, and things like that. Compare validator is the one and only control that we can use just for data type validation. We don't have to actually compare it to anything if we don't want to. We can just say, make sure this is a valid integer or a valid currency value, things like that. Regular expressions. How many people have used regular expressions before? My sympathies. Okay. Yeah, regular expression, although, once you get onto it, you'll hate it a little bit less. But I don't know anybody that really likes regular expressions. They're this cryptic, kind of like writing, caret D / X, it's really cryptic way to describe a pattern of characters. That's what it comes down to. A regular expression defines a pattern of characters. So many digits and things like that. So it's great for certain things like making sure a bank account number, right, is entered in the proper form. So many digits, a dash, and so on. Or think even something like our Canadian postal codes. Letter, number, letter, space, number, and things like that. So with a regular expression, you can guarantee the data entered matches a specific pattern, right? So very, very powerful and useful as well. And all we have to do is supply the regular expression, right? There's a limited number available right in the interactive using Visual Studio into the tool that are predefined for you. But just go out on the internet to search for like regex.com, or there's all kinds of libraries where you can, find all different regex expressions that people have submitted for different things. But if none of those work for what you need, there's also the custom validation control. Okay, now this one kind of almost defeats the purpose, but it still is useful because it will vary the output depending on the requirements of the local browser, client browser. But basically this one you have to write the code. At the minimum you have to write the server-side code to do whatever validation you want, right? If it's just something you can't do with the others. Optionally, you can also provide client-side code that it will use if the browser locally will support it. Finally, the last one up here is the summary control. When you did your validation, did you bring up some sort of a message listing all the problems on the page? that something you did inside your exercises? Yeah. Well, that's what the summary does for you automatically. As you stick it on the page, your work is done. Whew! Go for coffee early, right? You might set a couple of properties, but basically it polls all the validators you have on the page to see if they're all happy. If they aren't, it will grab its error message and add it to the list of things to inform the user about. And we'll see there's various options. You can use a message box or have it just show on the page, right? And it's very, very easy to use. So we'll play around with those quite a bit over the next week and a half or so. All right. By the way, you can attach more than one. There's the Ginsu knives coming out again. Yes, put a required field validator on, but maybe that's not enough. It's not just that something is entered, but you want to check the quality of the data entered as well. So we will combine several of these validators. Usually they're required with one of the others, right? We can combine them together on the same input. So check not only that something is there, but it's the right kind of something as well, right? And the last thing to be aware of about this is the validation always happens on the server with all these controls. So when the data gets to the server, it gets validated there. If the client browser is capable of it, it will also generate its own. You don't have to write any of this client-side script. It will write it in the appropriate flavor for the browser and send it down, so it also happens on the client side. Client side is nice because without even sending data through the internet, right, it can just make sure things are filled in and they're in the right ranges and so on and so forth, right? And so it's very fast. It's a little more efficient, right, to do it on the client first. But it's good. It's good design that it also gets double checked on the server when the data gets there. How many people have ever used a tool like Fiddler? Okay, it's a very popular one. It's a plugin for Firefox originally, but I think it works in other browsers now as well. But basically, it allows you to examine all the data coming in and out of the browser. So before a response is sent to a web server, you can see all the data in there and manipulate it. Ooh, great hacking tool, right? You could go in and, maybe there's checks and balances and so on, but you could go in and modify the data that's been filled out in the form where client-side validation said, well, this has to be in this range of values. You could change it before it actually goes to the server, right? Sneaky. But fortunately, it will be validated again on the server and rejected, right? So if the minimum bid is 1,000, somebody uses Fiddler to go in and put in $1, right? They've already circumvented the client-side validation, but the server side would catch it. Okay. By the way, when it gets checked again on the server, in code we can check page.isValid. It will be Boolean, true or false. So that helps us to decide on the server side, whether everything was valid in the data that came in. And of course on the client side, the validation summary will only appear if there's a problem with any of the validators on the page. All right, just a little side thing we have to deal with because I like to start off this course. This is a brand new technology we haven't used before. If you start with one of the full templates, when you go and select new project, it comes with everything but the kitchen sink in there, right? All these libraries for Bootstrap CSS and jQuery UI and all this stuff is all included in there. It's quite messy and busy, right? So I like to start with an empty ASP.NET application or website. It's less cluttered, and we can see what and we'll just add the bits that we actually need, right, at the beginning. Problem with that is, ever since .NET 4.5, the system wants to use the newer, unobtrusive JavaScript approach for client-side validation and so on. And because we're starting empty, we don't have any of those libraries yet. So there's a quick and easy workaround for us. In our web config file, I'll show you that in a few minutes, there's a little configuration file for the whole web application. We just have to add this little setting in here to say basically, validation setting, unobtrusive validation mode, nah, we don't want it, none, right? And then that way it falls back to the old-fashioned approach before unobtrusive, and it still works, right? So I'm just mentioning that now. Later on when we start using the full template, right, with all the bells and whistles in it, we won't have to worry about this anymore because it'll have all the libraries we could possibly want, right? With bundling and minification, all these great new things to help make our website fast and efficient. But for now, this is our workaround, so we can have a simple website to start with. All right, enough theory? Woohoo! Okay, we're ready to start playing with this stuff again. So how are we for time? 9:26. I'm going to stop recording.